Welcome to the APM podcast. APM is the chartered body for the project profession. My name is Emma DeVita and I'm the editor of Project, APM's quarterly journal and your host. In this podcast, I'm speaking to Jonathan Simcock, a highly experienced and respected project leader in the UK, who has held executive roles in oil and gas, energy, utilities and telecommunication sectors. He has been involved in the largest UK government project since 2007, when he took over what became the Infrastructure and Projects Authority and is now the National Infrastructure and Service Transformation Authority, or NISTA. Until last year, he was chair of the Submarine Delivery Agency in the MOD. His book, The Delivery Gap: Why Government Projects Really Fail and What Can Be Done About It, comes out later this month and is available for pre-order now. When the UK is facing low growth, poor productivity, an increasingly insecure world and climate change, closing the delivery gap is an imperative as important as any of the other challenges of statesmanship, he argues. So we at the APM podcast couldn't wait to get him into the studio and ask him what he's learnt about delivering government projects, whether they're all doomed to fail, and what it takes to deliver some of the largest and most complex projects successfully. Welcome, Jonathan. Thanks for joining us at the APM podcast. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you ever so much for inviting me.
No, it's a pleasure. I would like to begin by asking you briefly about your career and what you're doing now.
So I spent the first 2/3 of my career probably in oil and gas. We didn't always call what I was doing projects in those days, but they were really big maintenance projects, we would call them now, capital projects. I did quite a lot of mergers and acquisitions. And then I did quite a lot of transformation, internal transformation in oil and gas businesses. But then, relevant to this conversation, in 2007, by a series of accidents, I ended up as the major projects director in something that was called the Office of Government Commerce, which, as you say, turned into the Major Projects Authority, then the Infrastructure Projects Authority, and has now been merged into the new body, NISTA. I have to say, in 2007, I was spectacularly underqualified for that job. I think I only got it because no civil servant of the right grade had applied. But since then, I've been leading, governing, advising, assuring on great big government projects one way or another. As you say, I was chair of the Submarine Delivery Authority until last year. And earlier this year, I stepped away from the board of Sellafield, the nuclear site in the northwest. What I'm doing now, I'm spending quite a lot of time promoting the delivery gap, and meanwhile waiting for the next challenge, probably in an advisory or a non-executive role.
Let's talk about your book. So it's called The Delivery Gap. What do you mean by that? What is the delivery gap? And why did you want to write the book now?
So I think that the level of public debate about great big projects is terribly shallow, very superficial in the media. So if you listen as I do to sort of political podcasts or read political books, then the reason we have problems in big projects, it's all to do with, if only we had some decent project managers, or if only politicians were different, we had some decent politicians, or if we sorted out the planning system. There is some truth, of course, in all of these things, but they betray a superficial understanding of what the challenges that really go on in great big projects. So I had in mind to write a book of explaining, why is this so hard? In fact, my first working title was not The Delivery Gap. It was How Hard Can It Be? But then in the wake of the HS2 failure, I'm going to call it failure, I realized that in my heart, I'm sometimes for these great big projects expecting them to fail. And I'll come back to what I mean by failure in a minute. And that felt really uncomfortable, particularly in the context that you mentioned, which is, we're in a country with low growth, with poor productivity, with a desperate need for infrastructure investment, with growing defence threats, We need projects. So to start to have this sort of mindset that, of course, these things never work, that's really unhealthy. So I wanted to get under the skin of what really is going on here. And I wanted it to be an insider's book. There are good project management books from academia. There are some quite good public sector project books from sort of journalistic view. But I wanted to spend time, and I have spent time talking with the ministers, the ex-ministers typically, senior officials, the delivery leaders, civil servants, the supply chain, to get more of an insider's view about what really is going on here. And I think my conclusion out of all of that is good people are struggling in a system that's failing. And it's to do with the incentive structures that drive tendencies and behaviors that lead to failure. And if we only think about improving the process and sorting out the planning system and so on, then we're not going to get to grips with the root causes here. The book is structured with 7 case studies at the beginning.
Which case studies do you cover in the book?
So I cover Crossrail, the Elizabeth Line. I cover the Palace of Westminster Restoration and Renewal project. I cover the Universal Credit project, completely different kind of project. I cover the smart meter implementation program, of which I'm definitely one of the guilty. I cover the huge project for privatizing the management of all of our nuclear legacy sites, including Sellafield, where I was on the board. I cover the National Programme for IT and the Health Service, massive top-down rewiring of the health service. And I cover the programme for the astute tax submarines. So you'll notice from these that I'm talking about huge projects. Most of these projects are 10 billion plus, and that's really the light. The light I'm trying to shine is on that kind of huge endeavour. So that's what motivated me to write the book. You asked me what I mean by the delivery gap. Yeah, success and failure of projects is not a simple subject. Actually, it's worth a conversation in its own right. But in the context of this book, what I really mean is as simple as, did we do what we said we were going to do on the day we said we were going to do it for the amount of money that we promised? Did we do what it says on the tin? A successful project will kind of meet its promise.
What if that promise gets redefined over many, many years?
So I think if the promise is redefined, so if we're halfway through something and we say, look, we don't really want a blue one, we've decided we now want a red one. And the project says, well, okay, if you want a red one, that's fine, but it's going to cost 2 billion more and arrive 5 years later. And everyone says, yes, we still want to do it. That can still be a successful project. However, as you know, as well as I do, Emma, any experienced project professional will tell you that the best way to kill a project is to change your mind halfway through about what you're trying to achieve. So the worst thing a project leader can do is to not face up to the realities of what change means, not force, if I can use that word, the stakeholders, the sponsors, the funders of the project to the consequences of the change they want to make, and fudge it to pretend that, well, we can sort of still do a blue one and it might be a little bit more expensive, but it probably won't, because that's what everybody wants to hear. So there's something really important about professional confidence and candor.
Candor. So actually, you're describing some behaviours there that I wanted to circle back round to, because you referred to incentives and behaviours, and perhaps the wrong behaviours are being encouraged. and perhaps not having candor is one of those behaviours. So could you tell us a bit more about that?
I spoke to a leader of a project that everybody, or almost everybody listening to this project will have heard of, who described the systemic pressure on them to undercook their estimates. Now he was absolutely clear that he wasn't going to do that, but he was also honest enough to say you shouldn't underestimate the ability to sort of get yourself to believe what you need to believe in order to get to where you want to get to. And so the example that he's using, I'm keeping it very anonymous here. He said, well, I'm going to say that it's, X billion and X years. And I know that if I said it was X plus 4 billion and years plus 3, that I wouldn't get next year's funding. And without next year's funding, I have no project. So he's not lying, but those pressures exist in the system. And somebody else described to me this tendency as limbo dancing. That's kind of what we do in developing big government projects.
Why do these pressures exist in the first place? And is it because of poor estimation, lack of clarity over the purpose of the project, political desires and ambition, and compounded with this kind of miscommunication and lack of trust because people don't stick around long enough? What would stop this happening in the first place?
All of the above. All of the above. So if a strong minister, so I'm now thinking about the case of universal credit, a strong minister with a very strong vision, determined to overcome any barrier to get going and to make this project survive and to get it going. Nobody in the system was strong enough to stand up to that. Not by saying, well, your project plan says this. Well, my project plan says that, because it was too early for a project plan. We haven't got a project yet. We don't know how we're going to do it. And the incentives in the system don't encourage anybody to stand up. What can we do about these things? When I started writing, after a little while, I felt I'm not really satisfied with this. And I realized that what was happening was I spent so many years writing gateway reviews or structured advice for senior officials or for ministers that I was cramping myself into a sort of a style of writing where I was continually hedging and thinking, well, how will that read to a minister, and how realistic will that be in the political context into which I'm delivering it, and could I rephrase this in a way which makes it gentler? And I had a conversation with a literary agent in the process of trying to get a publisher, and he said, that's really not what you're trying to do here. You're not trying to produce a sort of a set of simple recommendations which are bound to be easily applicable in the environment you're talking to. You're trying to advance the debate. You're trying to get people thinking about things in a different way. And suddenly I found myself much freer to think about things which, wouldn't look particularly easy if they landed on the desk in NISTA the day after tomorrow. But I came into that conversation because you asked me, what can we do about this? One of the things I feel more and more strongly about is that the players in this game, with the probable exception of the politicians, we should be subject to a kind of a duty of candor. Now, it shouldn't be okay to allow a business case to go forward with estimates that are undercooked, where everyone sort of knows they're undercooked, but this is what we need in order to get the project going. And this isn't a criticism of individual project people. Let's say it is to do with the system. And so one of the things I think we need is rather than the mountain of project assurance which any big project in government gets drowned by. I think there should be something that is genuinely independent, that the professional knows is going to be exposed, but to people, to a small group of experienced people who can hold them to account. No, that doesn't exist at the moment. The National Audit Office is a wonderful institution and full of wisdom that nobody particularly takes much notice of. But it's auditing, it's backward looking. I'm talking about something that would feel a bit more like a kind of project equivalent of the Office of Budget Responsibility. And consequently, everybody will hate this idea. But do you see what I mean?
Is that not part of NISTA's role?
I'm sure it is, and you can follow that thread right back to my time in Number 1 Horse Guards Road in the Treasury. But NISTA's not independent. Everybody involved in that decision making works for the Prime Minister. It's just not independent.
Yeah, completely outside of that. What were you going to say about Crossrail?
I don't know if I mentioned this earlier on, but everyone, I guess, remembers this. That first of all, just to be completely clear, Crossrail is a fantastic piece of infrastructure. One that the nation should be proud of, and the people that built it should be proud of, and is delivering above its volumes and its passenger numbers and so on. And the early phases of the Crossrail project went brilliantly well. The civil phases were a miracle. However, in August 2018, the project was still saying that it was going to open the central section of the railway in December 2018, in 4 months' time. And at that point, the underlying problems became undeniable and surfaced publicly. And the overall railway was not fully opened until 2023. Billions of pounds more spent and years more consumed. And yes, it's a wonderful railway, but that is not okay. So the people leading that programme, some of them knew but weren't prepared to say, and some of them had managed to convince themselves that they didn't know. That is not all right. That's the kind of behaviours, if you like, the tendencies which we've got to overcome. I use this as an extreme example, but just to be clear, this is absolutely not a unique situation. I have sat around so many tables where everybody kind of knows that the schedule that they're looking at is not a realistic one. And then the project leaders will look at each other and say, well, if we rebaseline now and say it's going to take another year, then in a year we'll have lost all of that float and we'll be back to rebaseline it again. There's this fear of facing reality.
To ask an obvious question, and the fear of facing that reality is the fear of what? What are the consequences they're seeking to avoid?
There is a genuine concern around project leadership tables in a situation where the schedule is under real pressure and where its likelihood of delivery has become very low or even non-existent. There is a genuine concern around that table that if you acknowledge that reality and say, to use the Crossrail example, it's not going to be 2018, it's going to be 2020, there is a concern around that table that a year later, all of that new float, all of that new schedule contingency would have got swallowed up, and that we'll be facing exactly the same situation again. And then it won't be 2020; it'll be 20. And there is some truth in that line, and it's a genuine tension in a big project to say at what point is the right point to rebaseline the schedule. It's a valuable and important conversation. However, there is something else going on, with that around that table, and that is, if I acknowledge this isn't going to get delivered, then I have to go and tell the sponsor this isn't going to get delivered. He has to then go and tell the minister, or in this case, the mayor, that it isn't going to get delivered. We'll end up with a team of outsiders will be sent in to work out why we've done such a bad job and what we should do differently. That's going to distract us for 6 months, and I might lose my job. And so these subtler tendencies, the subtler incentives, encourage the delusion, encourage the obfuscation, encourage the unreasonable optimism that is endemic in a lot of government projects.
But this is known about, isn't it? That people have this optimism bias. Why does this still happen? What fundamentally needs to change then?
Yeah. So I love the phrase optimism bias. It sounds, doesn't it? It sounds like a kind of a very human sort of tendency to look on the bright side. It's quite a warm thing, optimistic. It sounds nice, doesn't it? What we're talking about in these kind of situations, and I'm going to use a deliberately nasty way of describing it. It's a kind of a collective conspiracy to delude ourselves, and not only ourselves, but our sort of stakeholders and funders. And that's why I think this happens a lot less in the private sector than it does still happens in the private sector, just to be clear, but it happens less often in the private sector than the public sector. So coming back to my requirement for candor, let's imagine a slightly different world than the one we're in. Let's imagine that the business case for this project, rather than being buried in bureaucracy in Whitehall, is, insofar as it can be done from a confidentiality point of view, in the public domain. And that the schedule has the name of the project director, in the public domain. This is the schedule which I say I can deliver. You hold me to this. And the cost estimations in a similar way. And that person knows that it is going to be viewed by these Office of Budget Responsibility, genuinely independent people who are reporting to Parliament rather than reporting to government, say. And then couple that with that everybody I've just talked about is likely to be in their jobs for 4 or 5 years rather than 18 months. So you can't. So there's much less incentive to sort of just keep your head down and hope that it'll all be all right when I leave it. What we've changed there is the incentives in the system, and it's those incentives, it's changes in those incentives, which will change the behaviours. I naively assert.
Do you think all the attention on data, analytics and AI is one of those things that people hope to solve project delivery with?
So I'm going to take you back bloody decades, because I talked about the Astute program. The Astute, is the attack submarines that form the attack submarine part of the Royal Navy's nuclear defence fleet. And by the time we finish the Astute program, there are still a couple of submarines still in the yard. Those 7 submarines will have taken pretty much exactly twice as long as the previous class of 7 submarines, the Trafalgar class, took back in the sort of 80s and 90s. One of the things people thought right at the beginning of the Astute program, and I recognise I'm talking 25 years ago now, was rather than using warehouses full of draftsmen with beautiful drafting boards and pens and inks, we're going to use this 3D CAD process. It's going to be, much better. And of course, 3D CAD is much better, and it's completely replaced hundreds of draftsmen with drawing boards. But at the time, it introduced a huge delay in the program, because the technology wasn't really up to something as complex as a nuclear submarine. You could use it for a simple ship, but it wouldn't do a nuclear submarine. And there weren't enough people skilled enough to use it. And so design went very much more slowly than it did. My suspicion is that that same pattern, hopefully it'll happen faster. We see some of that pattern with AI and learning technologies. If we come back in 10 years' time, they'll have made a huge impact. But I fear we'll go down a lot of rabbit holes first if we're not careful. And so I'd encourage people to experiment, to try, but not to lose sight of the fundamentals of designing and building complex projects.
The kind of prevalent cultural attitude that these projects are doomed to fail, how do you shift that? Is it about finding pockets of success and reminding people about those? The APM salary survey this year showed that there was a great distrust in the success of major government projects. So it's kind of entrenched and expected. So put your shoes in someone who's trying to lead a project, maybe not at a massive scale, but faces this expectation of failure. What on earth do you do to try and make the people you're working with think that, no, we can do this well?
The things I'm about to mention, anybody that's been living in this world for 10 years will recognize them. So things like, the delivery professions, including project management in government, should have the same kind of esteem in government as policy development. Ministers and civil servants should spend longer in their jobs. The challenge of a project should be matched by the capability and resources that are required to deliver it. This is not rocket science. Projects shouldn't be initiated without clarity about what they're trying to achieve. The cost and schedule estimation of projects should genuinely take accountability of uncertainty, which means that early on, you're going to have very wide bounds of cost estimate. And the tendency will, for everybody, want you to be much, much more specific and exact before you know really what you're doing. So these are all really well-known, unanticipated pressures on cost and schedule should be brought out into the open and acknowledged and dealt with as you go along. We've been talking mostly in this conversation about why these underlying things prevent these well-known things being addressed. We talked about duty of candor. We don't need to talk about that anymore. Let me talk about two others. The first is, if you're that project leader, place a really high value on simplicity. Try to avoid the pressures in the system, which will lead you to more and more complexity. I'm going to give you again. I'll be brief. An example that I unfortunately know a lot about, which is the smart metering program, where in pursuit of theoretical perfection, we developed a complex solution which became functionally undeliverable, at least in the context of the timescales that the government wanted to deliver. So rather than finishing the project in 2020, it'll be that the current timeline says 80% of homes in 2026, but I'm not holding my breath. So we could have done something much, much simpler. It wouldn't have had all the bells and whistles of benefits, but then it would have been delivered, a decade earlier. And therefore, who knows what we're doing with technology by now. So one really important thing is prioritizing simplicity over complexity. And the other, which is less in the hands of the project leader, perhaps, is, so I don't know if you've noticed how many times big projects get announced. How many times was HS2 announced between its first conception in sort of 2009 and an actual formal business decision being made in 2020? Boris Johnson approved phase one in 2020. It must have been announced, 20 times. So the world takes a huge account of announcements, even though they don't really mean very much, and takes almost no account of actual formal commitments, business commitments. And if I were king for a day, I would correct that balance so that I mentioned before publishing of business cases, proper formal announcements of when ministers have genuinely made a clear, not political intent, but an actual investment decision that should be very clear, very explicit, and very public.
But because you're hugely experienced, I wanted to find out from you what perhaps have been the most important career lessons, maybe one or two that you've learnt. So either personally as a kind of project person and or related to projects as well. So if you could pass on any advice, wisdom to project professionals out there who perhaps aren't as senior as you, maybe something you would have told a younger version of yourself.
Well, I guess the first thing I'd say is, stick with it. These are fantastic careers. Being involved in these huge endeavors, world scale projects. Don't let old grumpy grey-haired men like me put you off. Still stick with it. That's the first message. The second is, I think, so professionalism. We've come such a long way with professionalism in the last 20 years. But professionalism is more than a collection of sort of niche technical capabilities, scheduling or cost estimating or risk management or whatever. I talked before about parity of esteem in a public sector context, parity of esteem with the sort of the policy and what one of my project friends used to call policy la land. So that parity of esteem starts with you if you're a project professional. So if the policy wonk can't explain how what they have written down as the scope of their project is really going to deliver what they think it will, you have to call them out on it. If the minister is unrealistic, and I know it's easy to say and it's hard to do, you have to step up and say so. So there's an element of courage that I would encourage people to adopt. And the final thing I would say is, be skeptical from time to time when you need to be, but don't ever let yourself drift into cynicism. Cynicism kills big projects. And in a way, it's kind of why I wanted to write the book, because I could feel that tendency in myself, the sort of this will never work tendency. And that we can't afford that as a country. We can't afford it. And there are things that we can do, and we have to do better.
Jonathan, that's a great way to end the podcast. I mean, it just leaves me to say thank you for your time and for such a thoughtful conversation, and obviously wish you the best of luck with your book. So thank you very much.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks ever so much. I'm sorry we meandered around a little bit.
No, that's the fun of it. I think I expect that, so I plan for that. Some contingency planning involved.
Well, that's what we need.
So thanks again for Jonathan for joining us, and to you for listening to the APM podcast. Just to mention again that his book, The Delivery Gap, Why Government Projects Really Fail and What Can Be Done About It, publishes in September 2025. Don't forget to look out for more episodes or to rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. We'd welcome you to get in touch with your comments, feedback and suggestions by emailing us at apmpodcast@thinkpublishing.co.uk. Spotify users can also send us feedback directly within the Spotify app. This podcast has been brought to you by APM, the chartered body for the project profession. For more information on APM, visit apm.org.uk.